Welcome back to our study of the background of the New Testament. We've been taking, I guess now for like the last couple of months or so, looking at the Old Testament part of that background. Of course, the Old Testament makes up a large portion of the Bibles we use today, and it's a very, very vital part of setting up the story of the ministry of Jesus and the apostles. So it's really hard to understand the New Testament and what's being taught there without having a background of everything that came before it. Again, our focus over the past several weeks has just been the Old Testament story. Lord willing, we'll be moving on to some of the period between the Testaments, but I thought it good at this particular time to just kind of do a review with everything that's been going on in the world with the virus and the shutdowns, and we've been able to meet and we haven't been able to meet, and it's been kind of hard to get a continuity, especially in a Bible class situation. So let's just go back today and kind of recap that Old Testament part of the background that we've been talking about for those various weeks. A bit of a review, if you will, so maybe we'll catch everybody and get everyone up to speed. Of course, we began at the beginning, and in that, of course, is the creation, the early chapters of the book of Genesis. We focused primarily on God's purposes for the humans who were the crowning part of that creation, Adam and Eve, referred to there in Genesis 1 and 2. We learned as we studied that part of the story that we're the product of divine collaboration. God said, "Let us make man in our image." We were created, of course, for fellowship with God. In the perfect beginning, God walked with Adam and Eve and had that type of close relationship. Humans out of all creation were created as these, what the Bible refers to as image bearers. Were made in the image of God. And contextually, we saw there in the book of Genesis that image bearing involved things like ruling or having dominion over the earth, filling it and subduing it. At the very least, those things are part of being God's imagers. And of course, we studied how God made provision to carry out his desires for us. Humanity was given everything necessary. It was a very good world, according to the end of chapter 1 there in Genesis. So that's the start. And that's the start of the story. Things, again, were as God intended at the very beginning. But it wasn't long, we discovered, before there was trouble in paradise. Chapter 3, of course, records the coming of the serpent. And we studied then how this appears to be a divine being bent on disrupting God's plan for humanity. We looked at other sections of the New Testament that talks about these divine rebels that tried to thwart the purposes of God, and that happened right at the very beginning. The temptation, of course, the serpent used with Adam and Eve was to grasp for something beyond what God had given them. Again, as I said a moment ago, God provided everything, but the serpent tempts Eve and Adam by saying, God's holding out on you. If you eat, you'll become wise, you'll become like God. And that's a strong temptation. Seems like, again, even when we're provided everything we need, there's this sense of wanting more. But due to their sin, going ahead and eating of the fruit, Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden, separating them from that close fellowship with God, which in context is the death that God is talking about. God warned them in chapter 2, verse 17, that when they ate the fruit, they would die. In the day they ate of it, they would die. And of course, that's what happened spiritually. Because of that sin, they were driven away from fellowship with God. Your sins have separated you from God, Isaiah talks about that. Of course, separation from God also assured their inevitable physical death as well. Separation from the tree of life was a consequence of that. But again, the sin referred to there is this wall between God and his image bearers. From that point on, again, that's the start there in Genesis chapter 1 through 3. From that point on, as we saw, things go from bad to worse in the early chapters of Genesis. You've got Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain killing Abel. Then you've got the world becoming increasingly wicked. The thoughts of the intentions of the hearts of man were only evil continually, as the Bible talks about. And that brought about the story of the flood, and righteous Noah and his immediate family saved through that, Genesis 6 through 9. Then you keep working your way toward chapter 11 of Genesis, where you've got, again, mankind congregating, not necessarily going out and doing what God had called them to do. And God, of course, scatters the nations there in Genesis 11. It's from that point on in the narrative, as we discovered, that God's restorative efforts, and I've said before, I want to emphasize again, the Bible is the story of God's efforts to restore what was lost in the garden. All right. God's perfect world and God's perfect plans were thwarted, derailed, if you will, by sinful actions, and God's not content to leave it that way. God is continuing to work to right the wrongs. And at this point, at the end of chapter 11, of course, God moves from working through humanity in general to working through one family, one man and his family, and eventually a nation. And that, of course, is the man Abraham. We spent some time talking about Abraham, didn't we? And that's an important part of the Bible story. Following the dispersal of the nations in Genesis 11 at Babel, God calls Abram to be the father of the nation through whom he would deal with the sin problem of humanity. There in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we've got God's call of this man from Ur of the Chaldees, east of Eden, if you will. God calls him and makes some promises. This call involved, as we saw in chapter 12, verse 1, a call to separate, to leave his country and from his relatives and from his father's house. So Abram was called to leave somewhere and to go somewhere as well in verse 1, Genesis 12, verse 1. Go to a land that I will show you. Part of the promise involved a progeny. God says, I'll make you a great nation. And then finally, verses 2 and 3, God spoke of the blessings that would come to Abram due to his faith. He says, I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So you've got that great promise of God. That's the seed, if you will, a promised seed of Abraham that would come and eventually be the one through whom God would restore the world. After discussing the call of Abraham, of course, then we did a very brief, as far as the history we covered, we did a flyover, if you will, of Old Testament history up to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And you may recall, as we studied that, we're talking about a period of some 1,500 years, 15 centuries from the time of Abraham to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. That basically covers Old Testament history. It's the story, of course, of the Old Covenant people of God. God, through Abram, the nation grew through Abraham's descendants to where they went into Egyptian slavery. Of course, you had Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And Joseph, of course, involved in the Egyptian story. God's people enslaved in Egypt for 4 centuries. God hears their cry, and emancipation comes. Moses is chosen by God to go and be that deliverer, and eventually, God bends his will to listen to him. Moses goes. You've got the plagues. Pharaoh lets the people go. They leave Egypt, go to Sinai, and of course, that's the establishment, if you will, of what we refer to as the Old Covenant. But that wasn't the end of the story as well. Even that emancipation from slavery led to more sin, leading to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, but they finally come to the promised land. They reach the promised land, but more rebellion, especially in the form of idolatry, leads to God's discipline and judgment. We track on through the story. They're living in the land, and the things aren't going well necessarily. So the people ask for a king against God's desires for them. You got this continued struggle to listen to God, to obey God. They ask for a king, and God gives them one. And even the golden age of King David had its flaws. David wasn't a perfect king. So you've got, again, these cycles of sin and rebellion and judgment and deliverance over and over again. It happens. But from the United Kingdom, the Bible story goes on, and to the story of when the nation and the kingdom divides. You've got the northern kingdom conquered by Assyria. It's taken into captivity for its rebellion. The southern kingdom of Judah makes it for another century and a half, basically, before it too is judged for its sin and conquered by the Babylonians. So again, they reap the harvest of their sin. Now again, we just rehearse all of this history, again, as a background to what's going to take place in the New Testament. That's what we're doing. We're studying the background of these things. And this story of the Old Covenant people of God is a very important part of that. It's easy for me, at least, to imagine the anticipation early on as Abraham and his descendants gathered around the campfires or in the tents and rehearsed these promises. Abraham telling his children, God promised me that these amazing things would come. But as time went on, and the struggles and the defeats seemed to overwhelm the times of victory, the edge was taken off the anticipation. In many ways, despair began to replace the excitement of that. So you've got the people longing for the promises of God, yet due to their sin, not fully realizing those things. And, as time goes on, perhaps they began to lose some of that hope. So after reviewing all of this history, again, some 1,500 years, we went back then to highlight the prophetic witness throughout the same time frame. Throughout this history that we just rehearsed, from Abraham to the fall of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, throughout that whole time period, God didn't leave his people to their own devices. He would send prophets, spokesmen, who would go and try to, again, bring the people back to God. The prophets of God, of course, confronted the Old Covenant people regarding their sin and rebellion over and over again. If you read the prophets, we have what we call the major prophets and the minor prophets, and that's just due to the size of their writings, the volume. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then you've got others. So many times God sent the prophets to confront his people regarding their sin and rebellion. We looked at numerous verses that spoke of how God says, you've forsaken that covenant. At Sinai, the people said, we will listen, we will do what you say, but their will fell short of what they promised to God. God says to the prophets, you've forsaken me, you've forsaken the covenant. And due to that, the prophet said, you're going to be removed from the land. The taking of the people into captivity shouldn't have been a surprise, because the prophets had said, this is what's going to happen if you don't listen to God, if you don't follow and obey. Over and over again, they warned of that. But once again, we don't listen as well as perhaps we ought to. So the prophet spoke plainly and directly about the consequences of the sin and rebellion that the people were in. But that's not all of the prophetic witness. We spoke at length also of the positive message the prophets brought to the people. The prophets spoke positively of a coming time when God would once again bless the Old Covenant people of God as well as the nations around them. Remember, that was part of that original promise to Abraham a long time earlier in the story. God says, I'll bless you, Abraham, I'll bless your descendants, and I'll also make you a blessing to the nations around you. Well, the prophets continued to speak of that promise. The sin and rebellion of God's people didn't derail what God was ultimately going to do through this deliverer. And that was part of the prophetic witness. There's someone coming, the seed of Abraham. We looked at the numerous verses that spoke of this coming one. The Jews in Hebrew referred to him as their Messiah. When we get to the New Testament, when you study the New Testament, it comes up once again, and we see that those promises of a deliverer were fulfilled in Christ. the Son of God who was sent from God to earth, incarnated, and would be that coming deliverer. What a great promise. We also looked at the prophetic witness regarding a new covenant that God said would be made. We looked at chapters like Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 31 through and following right there. Through that prophet, a long time before the time of Jesus, Jeremiah, God said through Jeremiah, the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Things hadn't gone necessarily so well under the old covenant. That's the story we've just rehearsed. Sin cropping up over and over again. And it's that old covenant was faulty due, the Hebrew writer says, to the sin of the people. All right. So a new covenant was needed. And the prophets like Jeremiah and others promised of this time when a new covenant would be established. Part of the prophetic witness as well was the fact that God says, I'm going to gather rather those who are scattered over and over again. We looked at numerous references in the prophets to the fact that God says the time is coming when I'll gather all my scattered people. Yes, the people were dispersed due to their sin. Assyrian captivity, Babylonian captivity, on it went. People were taken from their land and spread far and wide in the world. But God said through the prophets, there's a time coming when I will gather them back together. Hope was held out in the midst of the words of forsaking the covenant and the sin. And the prophets never left the people without hope. They spoke often of a remnant. We saw some verses tied to that. But hope would be restored. And finally, we talked about how the prophet spoke of how God's Spirit would be poured out in that time as well. So again, if you will, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. As bad as things got in old covenant history, God was still working things out. The time was coming when the wrongs would be made right, when a deliverer would come, and God would fulfill every promise that he made. More closely to what we've talked about just last week in our Bible class, we saw that the time marker, all the prophets tied to these promises we've just rehearsed, this coming deliverer, a new covenant, the scattered would be gathered, hope and promise would be fulfilled, God's Spirit would be poured out. All of those promises we saw, there was a common time marker that the prophets put on that. And that was the sense of these prophets tied all of these promises to what they referred to as the last days. Most commonly, that was the phrase used. In other places, it spoke of the latter days or time of the end. Those are all synonyms. The most common one was the prophet says, in the last days, these things would happen. And that's a buzzword even yet today throughout biblical, human history. Those that were interested in biblical things, talk about the last days and, TV preachers and on it goes, make a lot of hay with that phrase. And a lot of it's misguided, at least in my estimation. We looked at the several sections in the prophetic writings which emphasize the last days, but then we went to the New Testament and discovered that the universal witness of the inspired writers in the time of Jesus and the apostles affirmed that they were then living in the last days in the first century. And that's a surprise to some people because you hear so often today, well, the last days have to be beyond us yet. Well, the New Testament writers had a different perspective. We looked at several verses from several different inspired men that spoke of they were living in the last days. In these last days, Peter would talk about these things were coming. The day of Pentecost was part of that fulfillment. In Joel 2, when God talks about pouring out his Spirit, Peter in Acts chapter 2 says, these are the days that it's coming to fruition. Paul spoke of it, and James and John, they're all formed a coherent witness to the fact that, at least in the Bible writers' minds of the New Testament, the last days were the days they were in. In fact, we saw places like 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. In fact, John at that time, that late stage in the first century, he says, 1 John 2:18, children, it is the last hour. And just as you've heard the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. And from this, we know that it is the last hour. So, the later it got toward, again, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the closer it got in those last days to being the last hour. And then finally, we ended last week with a reminder of what Jesus himself said in Luke chapter 21. And this just testifies to the fact, at least of the mindset of Jesus, of again, being in the time of the fulfillment of the things that God had promised. And of course, Jesus played a key, preeminent role in the fulfillment of all of these things. He was the Messiah. He was the one sent to die and rise again and have this new kingdom. In Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 22, here again, the words of Jesus. He's talking about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, spoken of specifically here. But notice what he says. Luke 21, verse 20 and following, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. So you've got the Roman armies. He said, when you see the Roman armies there and the Roman Jewish war, 66 to 70 AD, Jesus says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, know that the time is at hand for its destruction. Then in verse 21, Jesus says, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. And these were just words of warning to Jesus, to the faithful. And when you see this, these are signs for you to get out of Jerusalem, to avoid being caught up in the conflagration. But notice what Jesus says in verse 22. He says, because these are days of vengeance, God pouring out his vengeance on Jerusalem, ultimately for the killing of Jesus. Jesus, speaking ahead of the things to come, God pouring out his judgment. These are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Did you catch that? All things which are written will be fulfilled. In Jesus's mind, these actions in the first century were the fulfillment of everything the prophets had been looking for. And then again, this is a whole study in and of itself, but we're just highlighting the last days, at least biblically, refer to the days Jesus and the apostles were living in. It's not something yet in our future. We're living in the benefits of what Jesus and God accomplished through him. But for our purposes here, as we draw our thoughts to a close, God's goal, of course, and I think we've said this or I've said this time and again as we went through these lessons, God's goal is to restore what was lost in Eden. I think that's a good way to look at the Bible story. The Bible begins with the garden and the perfection there of what God began with. Sin entered and trouble came. And of course, the rest of that story is the restoring of what was lost in Eden. Fellowship with God was lost in Eden, banishment from the tree of life, banishment from the garden. But yet, by the time you get to the end of the Bible story in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, we find references there, of course, that are very Edenic. You've got the river of life and the healing of the nations and the tree of life. So God takes that history. We're studying a vast section of that history right now. But that's the story, God restoring what was lost in Eden. Hope that makes some sense. Again, I thought it best to probably pause at this point to kind of catch everybody up to speed, because Lord willing, next class period, we're going to start into the history of that time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, because that's another vital part of what's going on for the background of the New Testament. The Bible doesn't record much about that, but yet that's an important part of setting the stage for the ministry of Jesus and the apostles. Some 400 years between the book of Malachi, if you will, and the Gospels in the New Testament. So we'll spend some time there as well, and hopefully you can look forward to that. Thank you for being part of our class, for checking out the video. I appreciate you studying along. So God bless and have a great day.